So, continuing with Chapter 18, we're going to look here at Section 2, the Spanish American War, also known as the Spam War. The big ideas for this section are what events or underlying causes in Cuba and in the U.S. led to the U.S. Spanish War, and what was the implication of the explosion of the USS Maine, and what are the immediate and long-term effects and results of the war. Now, before we start looking into the Spam War, let's look at the Spanish Empire around the 1600s or so, and then we'll compare it to the 1800s. At the 1600s, the beginning of the 1600s, was the height of the Spanish Empire. The Spanish had owned all this land here. They owned and controlled most of the Spanish-speaking area of South America, a great deal in the Caribbean. They had various sites in Africa, especially along the coast. They also had the same throughout India trading sites in modern-day Arabia and controlled the Spanish West Indies. This is them in the early 1600s. Now let's fast forward to the 1800s. By this time, the Spanish had lost this whole section here as all these countries fought independent wars or wars for independence, and they gained their independence. The only real treasures that Spain had left at this point was the Spanish East Indies, a few trading sites in this area, Cuba, Puerto Rico, and a few islands over here. So a great contrast. And this is kind of the green you see here, what the landscape of the world looks like just before the dawn of the Spanish-American War. Due to the fact that Cuba geographically is very close to the United States, it's only 90 miles south of Florida, the United States and Cuba have a long history and relationship between the two countries. And in fact, the relationship was so strong that in 1854, Franklin Pierce offered to buy the island of Cuba from Spain. Although the Spanish responded, saying that they would rather see Cuba sunk in the bottom of the ocean than in the hands of the United States. During this time, there was great resentment on the island by Cubans for their Spanish oppressors. In this time, from 1868 to 1878, there's a series of Cuban civil wars in which the Cuban people tried to declare their independence from the Spanish crown. Unfortunately, they are not successful in doing so. After the violence from the Cuban people against the Spanish continued their legacy of brutalness and brutality in the New World. And this is actually a picture here of what they call the Cuban concentration camps. Here you can see it better. And what happened is the Spanish ended up killing close to 500,000 Cubans through the brutal tactics and concentration camps they established. As news started to seep out of Cuba about these concentration camps, there was growing support in the United States to declare war against the Spanish. One of the greatest founders of the Cuban Revolution movement was José Martín. You can see here, he was a Cuban poet and journalist who was exiled to New York. And in 1895, he encouraged the United States to gang up with Cuba and resist the Spanish influence. He did this through the Cuba Libre, or the Free Cuba movement. While José Martín and his efforts within the United States to declare war against the Spanish may have helped gain some popular support, what really did help was the rise of yellow journalism. Again, this is a key idea here for this entire time period, actually. So the idea of yellow journalism is a style pioneered by William Randolph Hearst that exaggerates the news to lure in or engage readers. This style of news was pioneered by him as he was the for his newspaper that he owned, the New York Journal. It was also pioneered by Joseph Pulitzer in his magazine and newspaper, the New York World. Both of them printed exaggerated stories based on news events in order to engage readers to buy their papers, but they were also responsible for spreading the anti-Spanish sentiment. This Free Cuba movement began to continue to rise in the United States, and this continued into William McKinley's presidency when he took office in 1897. He first tried, though, diplomatic relations with the Spanish to repair the relationships and help the Cubans out. And he had first started to succeed as Spain recalled General Weyler, who was responsible for those concentration camps that we talked about. Tensions, however, continued to escalate. In February of 1898, when the New York Journal published a letter written by Enrique Dupuy de Limon, the Spanish minister to the United States, criticizing President McKinley, calling him weak. And even though the minister ended up resigning over this scandal, it left a tarnished reputation again for the Spanish in America. Here you can see the actual letter coming from the Consulate of Spain right here, written to another Spanish member. It was, however, stolen by a Cuban rebel. Then, just a few days after the letter was published, President McKinley ordered the USS Maine, which is a warship that, if you remember, we talked about last section, that Admiral Alfred Monaghan encouraged the Congress to build these warships, and the USS Maine was one of them. And President McKinley ordered this warship to Havana to rescue some of American citizens that were in danger. On February 15th, however, of 1989, so just a few days after the letter, the ship exploded and 260 men were killed on board. No one knows to this day who is responsible for exploding the Maine. There's reports that it was the Spanish government. There's also reports that it was the Cuban rebels who did it to make it look like the Spanish. Either way, the stories of the Maine explosion used here were exaggerated through yellow journalism, which really, throughout the United States, increased all Americans on board against fighting a common enemy, the Spanish. You can see here in this newspaper article just an example of yellow journalism. They took the story of the Maine and exaggerated it where the headline says, "Crisis is at hand of Spanish treachery." Just the adjectives alone that they use make you feel that it's important or imperative for the United States to declare war against the Spanish. And the reason the Maine is such an important sticking point in this war is it's because it's really the battle cry of the war. You see here on the button that "Remember the Maine" becomes the slogan of the war. It was America's duty to revenge the deaths of those 260 sailors that were bombed in Havana trying to rescue other American citizens, and therefore the U.S. needed to declare war. Now, what's important to know is that the Spanish War was fought on two fronts. You have a map here from your textbook that does a great illustration of it. You first have it in the Caribbean, where the war starts, and this is Havana here, where the Maine was exploded. It also happens in the Philippines, so in Asia. And even though the Maine was exploded on February 15th of 1898, Congress didn't actually declare war against the Spanish until April 20th of that same year. So it took a few months for first President McKinley to ask Congress to declare war, and then it took an additional week for Congress to debate the merits of declaring war against the Spanish, which they finally did on April 20th. This was a relatively short war in comparison to American history. You have a few battles here marked by a bullet hole in the Caribbean, and then you also have two skirmishes in the Philippines. The main one happened when General George Dewey took the United States Navy into Manila here, where the Spanish Navy was residing. They opened fire against the Spanish Navy on April 30th, so just 10 days later. And they essentially knocked out the entire Spanish militia, basically in that skirmish there. You have support from the Filipinos as well, advocating for the Americans, because the Filipinos believed that if America won the war, they would lose their Spanish colonizer, and then they would be free to govern themselves. So there was a benefit for them to take the sides of the Americans. Now, going back to the Caribbean side here, you can see this little jagged line here is a blockade that the United States established around the island of Cuba, so the Spanish could not send any reinforcements. At the same time that they were establishing this blockade, they also had an influx of people signing up to be soldiers in the war. They actually had 125,000 Americans who volunteered to fight. The problem was most weren't equipped or had experience to fight, as the Civil War happened about 50 years earlier, so there's a big delay between fighting. It also was a problem for the United States equipment because they only had heavy woolen uniforms used in the Civil War, except Cuba lies along the Tropic of Cancer. So it has tropical weather, it's very warm, and the uniforms that the United States had actually was a hindrance to them. Even with some of the problems getting established, 17,000 troops ended up going to Cuba in June of 1898. One of the most famous regiments within the war were the Rough Riders, which was a volunteer cavalry under the command of Leonard Wood and Theodore Roosevelt. Now, Teddy Roosevelt, we've already talked about, will become president. He left his job as Assistant Secretary of the Navy to lead this group of volunteers into battle. The most iconic battle is depicted in this picture here. You see Teddy Roosevelt on his horse. He's leading the other volunteers, and they are charging up San Juan Hill. And even though the Rough Riders were only a small group of fighters, they had a lasting legacy, most likely due to their leader being the future president of the United States. After battles in Santiago and in San Juan, the Spanish tried to leave the American blockade around the island. Their navy was destroyed by the American Navy again. So the American Navy had destroyed basically the entire Spanish Navy in Manila in the Philippines, or once they tried to leave Cuba. Once this happened, the Spanish essentially lost the war, and the U.S. took their victory on to Puerto Rico, where they took over that island as well. On July 25th of 1898. The ceasefire had actually ended then on August 12th of that same year, 1898, and it's known as a splendid little war. The phrase was coined by current Secretary of State at the time, John Hay, as the fighting only lasted 15 weeks. It's actually the shortest war in American history. On December 10th of that year, the United States and Spain met in Paris to agree on a treaty and start peace talks about the various islands and the money that would be exchanged between sides. The peace deal, coined the Treaty of Paris, brokered this deal. First, that Cuba would become a free island. Two, that Guam and Puerto Rico were turned over as protectorates to the United States, and they still are protectorates today, which means that they are part of the country, but they are not a state. So they have some of the same advantages. They are American citizens, they can travel to the United States, but they don't vote for the president, nor do they pay federal income taxes. The third one, and the most controversial of the treaty, was the Philippines. As Spain sold the islands, which they had in their possession as the Spanish East Indies, to the United States for a price of $20 million. And the Philippines essentially became the America's colony. This was very controversial because as America was fighting, they had the support of the Filipinos who believed, after America had somewhat promised them, that they were going to be free, that they were going to be able to govern themselves. And this isn't really what happened. You can see a quote here by President McKinley, who gave justification as to why the United States needed to take over control of the Philippines, that there was nothing left at the Philippine Islands after the war, and that the United States had a job to educate the Filipinos and uplift and Christianize them. Once the terms of this treaty were agreed upon, they became ratified, which means they became a law, the following year on February 6, 1899. So the last big idea that we need to talk about in this section is what are the lasting effects of the Spam War? Well, let's first look at Puerto Rico right here. What happened with them? Congress passed the Volcker Act in 1900, and what it stated is that it ended military rule, so the United States military rule, and it set up a civil government. It also gave the American president the power to appoint Puerto Rico's governor and the members of its upper house of the legislature, and the people could then popularly elect the lower house of the legislature. And then in 1917, after some battles within Congress and the Supreme Court, Puerto Ricans were gained and granted U.S. citizenship. Now let's move on to Cuba here. In 1900, the newly formed Cuban government wrote their own constitution for an independent country. The constitution, though, was broad and didn't specify the relationship between Cuba and the United States. So in 1901, the U.S. issued the Platt Amendment to their constitution. And what it said was a few things. One, that Cuba could not make treaties that would limit its own independence or permit a foreign country for taking part of its territory. Meaning, they couldn't sign a treaty with, let's say, France, who could then come into their island and dictate or rule the island for them. The amendment also stated that the U.S. had the right reserved to intervene at any time to the country. And this is important because the U.S. right here is only 90 miles north. They have a huge economic interest. So they had the right, if they needed to politically intervene within the country. The amendment also stated that Cuba could not go into debt for any reason, which would limit the actions of the federal government. And the amendment stated that the U.S. could buy or lease land off the island for naval stations. This is important later as this will become debated with the whole Guantanamo Bay situation. As you can imagine, the deals of the Treaty of Paris for the Philippines were not as desirable as they would have liked. Their leader, Emilio Aguinaldo, believed that the United States had lied to them and promised them independence. So he led a revolt against the United States. The revolt started in February 1899 and took about 4 years for the United States to put down. It also cost the country about $400 million. Now remember, the terms of the Treaty of Paris stated that the United States bought the country from Spain for only $20 million. So that's a huge increase over the price that it cost for the United States to buy the island. In fact, it's 20 times more. Now, the Filipinos knew their land well, and they resorted to guerrilla warfare, and to which the U.S. responded by putting Filipinos into designated zones, similar to concentration camps. Unlike many other concentration camps at the time, though, you don't see the atrocities that are purposely being committed against the people. These camps were used more as a way to organize the citizens and to stop them from using guerrilla warfare tactics against the United States Army and Navy. Once the fighting had stopped, the two countries reached an agreement, to which the Filipinos would gradually, over time, become more independent. They finally became fully independent on July 4th, 1946, so after the end of World War II. Gradually, over time, they mimicked the same style of government that you see in Puerto Rico, where the Filipinos would elect the lower house, and the President of the United States would appoint the governor and the upper house of their Congress. By 1946, however, they became independent, and today the Philippines operates as an independent country on their own, with little to no U.S. involvement. We do, however, continue to have economic ties with them. So, what are the big ideas? What are the things that we learned in this lesson? First, the idea that the events in Cuba and the United States led to the Spanish-American War. Those events being the explosion of the Maine, the De Lome letter from the Spanish official citing McKinley's weakness, and it also was growing resentment. And not to mention yellow journalism, the idea that journalists were taking these types of stories and exaggerating them for the American public. Number two, we kind of touched upon this already, the implication of the Maine. The Maine exploded, killing 260 Americans. Through the idea of yellow journalism, you have a huge outcry within America that encouraged the government to eventually declare war on the Spanish. Now, that's not the only reason, but it's a combination of all of these events. Then, after the Spam War, you have some immediate and long-term results. First, Cuba becomes an independent country with a constitution and democracy supervised by the American government. You have Puerto Rico and Guam that become protectorates of the United States, and these protectorates are still owned by the United States today. And then you have the Philippines. They eventually become their own independent country after years of fighting because they became first an American colony. Then through a revolt, they fought the Americans and they eventually earned their independence. So that concludes our video segment on section 18.2, the Spanish-American War. Until next time, Husky historians.